When my wife died, my son sold the house without my permission, set fire to my Mercedes, and shouted, "Go to the streets! I have no ties with you anymore." I begged for help, and he turned his back. The next day, my lawyer made a phone call that made him come to me in tears. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I never thought the worst day of my life would come right after burying my wife. Helen had been gone for 3 days, and I was still wearing the same black suit from her funeral. I couldn't bring myself to change it, as if taking it off would somehow make her death more real. The house felt enormous and suffocating at the same time, every corner echoing with memories of our 35 years together. I was sitting in Helen's chair by the window, holding her favorite coffee mug, when I heard David's key in the front door. My heart lifted for the first time since Helen passed. My son was coming to check on me, maybe to talk about the arrangements, or just to sit with me in this unbearable silence. At 60 years old, I needed my only child more than ever. But the moment David walked into the living room, I knew something was terribly wrong. His face was cold, distant. Behind him stood Jessica, his wife of 2 years, her arms crossed, and her expression harder than I'd ever seen it. She wasn't wearing black. She was wearing a bright red blazer, as if she were heading to a business meeting instead of comforting a grieving family. "Dad, we need to talk," David said, without even greeting me. No hug, no "How are you holding up?" Just those 5 words that made my stomach drop. I set Helen's mug down carefully on the side table. "Of course, son. Sit down. You want some coffee?" "I'm not staying long." His voice was flat, mechanical. "Jessica and I have made some decisions." I looked between them, confusion washing over me. "What kind of decisions?" Jessica stepped forward, her high heels clicking against Helen's hardwood floors. "Robert, we've sold the house." For a moment I couldn't process what she'd said. The words hung in the air like smoke. "You've what?" "The house is sold," David repeated, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "The new owners take possession next week." My hands started shaking. "David, this is my home. This is where your mother and I raised you, where Helen and I lived for over 3 decades. You can't just—" "Actually, I can," he interrupted, his voice growing colder. "The house was in both our names after Mom died. With Helen gone, I have every legal right." I stared at my son, this stranger wearing David's face. "But where am I supposed to go?" Jessica laughed, actually laughed, a sharp sound that cut through me. "That's not our problem anymore, Robert. You're a grown man. Figure it out." I felt like I was drowning. "David, please. This has to be some kind of joke. Your stepmother just died 3 days ago. I'm grieving, I'm lost, and you're telling me I have to leave my home?" "Helen wasn't my mother," David snapped, and those words hit me like a physical blow. "She was your wife. And frankly, Dad, Jessica and I are tired of carrying you." "Carrying me?" I'd worked 3 jobs after David's mother died to put him through medical school. I'd sacrificed everything, including my own health, to make sure he had every opportunity. And now he was talking about carrying me? "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What happened to you?" David's jaw tightened. "I grew up, Dad. I realized I have my own family to think about now. Jessica and I want to start fresh, and we can't do that with you clinging to us." "I'm not clinging to anyone. I just buried my wife 3 days ago." "And that's sad," Jessica said with mock sympathy. "But life goes on. David and I have plans, and those plans don't include supporting you indefinitely." Supporting me? I'd never asked them for a penny. I had my own modest savings, my Social Security, Helen's life insurance. I wasn't some burden they needed to carry. "David," I tried one more time, reaching out to touch his arm. "Please, just give me time to process this. I'll find somewhere to go, but I need a few weeks to—" He jerked away from my touch. "No, you have until tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning?" My knees nearly buckled. "That's impossible. I can't find a place to live overnight." "Should have thought of that before," Jessica said, examining her manicured nails. "Oh, and Robert, that old Mercedes of yours, the one you're always so proud of, we took care of that too." Before I could ask what she meant, I heard the sound of breaking glass from outside. I rushed to the window and saw my beautiful silver Mercedes, the car Helen had surprised me with for my 58th birthday, engulfed in flames in the driveway. "David, Was holding a baseball bat, having just smashed the windows before setting it on fire. "You're insane!" I screamed, running toward the front door. David blocked my path. "The car was a safety hazard anyway. You're too old to be driving." I stared at him, this man I'd raised from infancy, nursed through childhood illnesses, cheered at graduation, walked down the aisle at his first wedding. His eyes were empty of any love or recognition. "Get out," he said quietly, "and don't come crawling back to us when you realize how hard life really is." I spent that night in a Walmart parking lot, sleeping in the back of a taxi I'd called to take me away from the house, my house, with nothing but a suitcase and Helen's jewelry box. The driver had felt sorry for me and let me sleep in his car for $50. $50 I couldn't afford to spend. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of late-night traffic and wondering how my life had fallen apart so completely. In just 72 hours, I kept thinking about something Helen had told me 2 weeks before she died. She'd been unusually serious, almost worried about something. "Robert," she'd said, gripping my hand tightly, "promise me something. If anything ever happens to me, if David ever tries to hurt you, you call Mr. Patterson immediately. Promise me." At the time, I'd thought she was just being dramatic because of her illness. Helen always worried too much about everything. But now, shivering in the back of that taxi, her words echoed in my mind like a lifeline. The thing was, I understood now what I should have seen all along. This wasn't grief making David cruel. This wasn't some temporary madness brought on by loss. This was calculated, planned, deliberate. Jessica hadn't just convinced my son to abandon me. She'd helped him orchestrate my destruction. I thought about the man I'd been 30 years ago when David's mother died in that car accident. I'd been devastated, lost, but I'd never once considered abandoning my 4-year-old son. Instead, I'd worked myself into exhaustion to make sure he had everything he needed. I'd given up my dreams of advancing in my engineering career to take jobs with flexible schedules. I'd sold my father's vintage watch to pay for David's Little League equipment. I'd missed countless opportunities because my son came first, always. And this was how he repaid that sacrifice. But lying there in that parking lot, surrounded by the debris of my shattered life, I felt something I hadn't expected. Underneath the grief and shock and betrayal, there was anger. Not the hot, explosive kind that makes you do stupid things, but something colder, more purposeful. Helen had tried to warn me about something. She'd seen this coming and tried to prepare me for it. The woman who'd spent 5 years loving me, caring for me, building a life with me. She'd known my own son was capable of this level of cruelty. Tomorrow, I would find out what Helen had been trying to tell me. Tomorrow, I would discover just how much my beloved wife had known about the son I thought I'd raised to be a good man. The next morning came too soon and not soon enough. I woke up stiff and cold in the back of that taxi, my neck aching from sleeping against the window. The driver, a kind man named Ahmed, had brought me coffee and a breakfast sandwich from McDonald's. I tried to pay him, but he waved my money away. "My father is your age," he said gently. "I cannot take money from you." His kindness made me want to cry. It struck me that a complete stranger was showing me more compassion than my own son. But I held it together. I had things to do, and I couldn't afford to fall apart now. As Ahmed drove away, leaving me standing outside the Walmart with my single suitcase, I made myself a promise. I would find out what Helen had been trying to protect me from. And if David thought he could destroy me and walk away without consequences, he was about to learn how wrong he was. I wasn't the broken old man they thought they were discarding. I was Robert Mitchell. And I had survived worse things than this. I would survive this too. The next morning, I needed to find somewhere to stay, at least temporarily. My first thought was the Riverside Motel on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, but clean and affordable. But when I tried to use my debit card to pay for a week, it was declined. I tried again, thinking it was a mistake. Declined again. "I'm sorry, sir," the desk clerk said, avoiding my eyes. "Do you have another card?" I called my bank from the motel lobby, my hands shaking as I dialed. After being transferred 3 times and waiting on hold for 20 minutes, a customer service representative finally explained what had happened. "Mr. Mitchell, your account has been frozen due to suspicious activity. It appears someone with joint access has claimed there's been fraudulent activity on the account. Joint access. David had been on my account since he was 18, originally so he could help me with banking when I was working multiple jobs and odd hours. I'd never removed him. Can you tell me who reported the suspicious activity? I'm sorry, sir, I can't release that information, but you'll need to come into the branch with documentation to resolve this. The nearest branch was 40 miles away, and I no longer had a car. I hung up the phone and stood in that motel lobby, feeling more lost than I had ever felt in my life. Around me, people moved with purpose, checking in, checking out, living their normal lives. I was invisible, a 60-year-old man with nowhere to go and no way to access his own money. I walked to the nearest payphone and started calling people I thought were friends. The first was Bill Watson, who'd been my neighbor for 12 years and had helped me install Helen's garden fence just last spring. "Oh, Robert," Bill's voice was uncomfortable, even through the scratchy phone line. "I'm so sorry about Helen. How are you holding up?" "Not well, I'm afraid." "Bill, I'm in a bit of a situation. David has asked me to move out of the house, and I'm wondering if I could stay with you for just a few days while I figure things out." There was a long pause. "Oh man, I wish I could help, but Sarah's mother just moved in with us after her hip surgery, and we don't have any room. Maybe you could try the Veterans Hall. They sometimes have programs for people in transition." People in transition. That's what I was now. I tried calling Jim Morrison next. Jim and I had worked together at the engineering firm for 15 years before we both retired. Surely he would understand. "Robert? Oh my goodness, I heard about Helen. I'm so sorry." Jim's voice was warm, genuine. "How are you doing?" I explained my situation, trying to keep my voice steady. "Wait," Jim said, confusion creeping into his tone. "David kicked you out. But Robert, that doesn't sound like the David I know. Are you sure you're not? I mean, grief can make us confused sometimes. Maybe you misunderstood what he was trying to say." "I didn't misunderstand anything, Jim. He sold the house. He burned my car. He told me not to come crawling back to them." Another pause. That's so unlike David. "Robert, I talked to him at the funeral, and he seemed so concerned about you. He said you'd been acting strangely since Helen got sick, that you were having some memory issues." Memory issues? My blood went cold. What exactly did he tell you? "He said Helen had been worried about you, that you'd been forgetting things, getting confused about money. He said you'd accused them of trying to steal from you, which was why Helen was so stressed toward the end." I couldn't breathe. David had been laying groundwork, preparing people to doubt my version of events. No wonder Bill had suggested the Veterans Hall, like I was some confused old man who couldn't take care of himself. "Jim, I don't have memory issues. I'm not confused. My son took advantage of me when I was grieving, and now he's spreading lies to cover his tracks." "Oh, buddy," Jim's voice was full of pity now. "Maybe you should talk to someone professional. David mentioned that there are some wonderful facilities that specialize in helping seniors with these kinds of problems." I hung up without saying goodbye. By the third call, I realized it was hopeless. David had been methodical, strategic. He'd told everyone the same story. His poor, confused father was having mental health issues and making wild accusations. He was the concerned son trying to get his dad help. I spent that day sitting on a bench outside the public library, watching people live their lives while mine crumbled around me. Children played in the park across the street. Mothers pushed strollers. Couples held hands. Life went on, but I felt frozen outside of it. That evening, I used my last $5 to buy a cup of coffee at a diner downtown. The waitress, a woman about Jessica's age, kept refilling it without charging me extra. She must have recognized desperation when she saw it. As I sat in that booth, stirring sugar into my third cup of coffee to make it last longer, I overheard a conversation at the next table. Two men were talking about their adult children. "The thing is," one was saying, "you raise them to be independent, and then they become so independent they forget you exist. My daughter hasn't called in 3 months. At least your daughter doesn't call you every day asking for money," the other replied. "Sometimes I think they only remember they have fathers when they need something." I wanted to turn around and tell them how lucky they were to have children who merely neglected them instead of destroying them. But I stayed silent, staring into my coffee, wondering how I'd ended up here. The diner closed at 10 and I had nowhere to go. I walked the streets until I found an all-night laundromat, where I spent the night sitting in a plastic chair, pretending to wait for laundry that didn't exist. The attendant pretended not to notice. As dawn broke through the laundromat's grimy windows, I tried to think clearly about what had happened. David hadn't just suddenly turned cruel. This had been planned. Jessica's behavior, the timing of everything, the way David had isolated me socially before making his move. This was a campaign, not an emotional breakdown. But why? What did they gain from destroying me? I didn't have much money, and what little I had, David would inherit anyway when I died. The house had some value, but not enough to justify this level of cruelty, unless there was something I didn't know, something Helen had discovered. I remembered her words again. If anything ever happens to me, if David ever tries to hurt you, you call Mr. Patterson immediately. Helen had seen this coming. She'd known David was capable of this, and she'd tried to prepare me for it. I made a decision as I sat in that laundromat, watching the sun come up on what might have been the lowest point of my life. I would walk to Mr. Patterson's office if I had to. I would find out what Helen had been trying to tell me. Because whatever she'd seen in David that I'd been too blind to notice, maybe it was the key to understanding how my life had become a nightmare. I had spent 2 days living like a homeless man, but I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The walk to Patterson's office would take me over an hour, but I had nothing but time. As I started walking through the quiet morning streets, passing houses where families were starting their days, making breakfast, getting ready for work and school, living normal lives, I thought about the irony of it all. I'd spent 30 years building a successful career as an engineer. I'd designed bridges and buildings that were still standing, structures that would outlast me by decades. I'd solved complex problems, managed teams, earned respect in my field. I'd raised a son who became a doctor, someone who was supposed to heal people, not harm them. And yet here I was, walking down a sidewalk with everything I owned in a single suitcase, abandoned by the person I'd loved most in the world. But as I walked, something else occurred to me. Helen had loved me. For 5 beautiful years, she'd chosen me every single day. She'd seen value in me that apparently my own son couldn't see. And in her final weeks, she'd tried to protect me from something she'd seen coming. That meant I wasn't worthless. I wasn't the burden David and Jessica had painted me as. I was a man who had earned the love of a wonderful woman, a man who had built things that mattered, a man who deserved better than what my son had done to me. By the time I reached Mr. Patterson's office, I was no longer the broken man who had spent the night in a laundromat. I was Robert Mitchell, and I was ready to find out what my wife had been trying to tell me. Walking to Mr. Patterson's office took me 2 hours. My feet were blistered by the time I reached the downtown law building, and I'm sure I looked like exactly what I was, a man who'd been sleeping in laundromats and living off diner coffee. But I'd made it. The receptionist at Patterson & Associates looked at me with barely concealed distaste. I was wearing the same clothes I'd had on for 3 days. My gray hair was uncombed, and I probably smelled like the industrial soap from the laundromat bathroom where I'd tried to freshen up. "I need to see Mr. Patterson," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady and dignified. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, not looking up from her computer screen. "No, but this is urgent. I'm Robert Mitchell. Mr. Patterson handled my late first wife's will 28 years ago, and my wife Helen's affairs as well." She finally looked at me, taking in my disheveled appearance. "Mr. Patterson is very busy today. Perhaps I could have him call you? I don't have a phone number where he can reach me right now." The admission was humiliating, but it was the truth. Something in my voice must have gotten through to her, because she softened slightly. "Let me see what I can do. Please have a seat." I sat in the waiting area, surrounded by leather chairs and mahogany tables that reminded me of better times. On the coffee table were magazines about luxury homes and investment strategies, publications for people who had money to invest and homes to decorate. I felt like an intruder. 20 minutes later, Mr. Patterson himself came out to greet me. He was older than I remembered, his hair completely white now, but his eyes were kind. He took one look at me, and his expression shifted from polite professionalism to genuine concern. "Robert, my dear fellow, what's happened to you?" I tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled rush. David's betrayal, being thrown out of my own house, sleeping in parking lots, my frozen bank account. As I spoke, Mr. Patterson's frown deepened. "Come into my office," he said gently. "Susan, please bring Mr. Mitchell some tea and see if we have any of those crackers left from the morning meeting." His office was exactly as I remembered it. Wall-to-wall law books, a massive oak desk, and photographs of his grandchildren scattered around. Being there brought back memories of sitting in that same chair 28 years ago, when my first wife, David's mother, had died. I was only 32 then, suddenly widowed, with a 4-year-old son to raise alone. Linda had been killed in that car accident, leaving behind debts I didn't even know existed. Mr. Patterson had been the one to explain that Linda's life insurance would barely cover the funeral costs, that the house would have to be sold, that David and I would have to start over with almost nothing. "I remember you," Mr. Patterson said softly, settling behind his desk. "You were one of the strongest men I'd ever met. You took that terrible news and you just handled it. You asked me what you needed to do to take care of your son, and then you did it." The memory hit me like a wave. I had been strong then, devastated, but strong. I'd taken a job as a night shift security guard so I could be home when David got out of school. When that wasn't enough, I'd added a weekend job doing construction cleanup. When that still wasn't enough, I'd started doing freelance engineering consulting in the evenings. "I worked 3 jobs for 6 years, I said, the memories flooding back. "I wanted David to have what other kids had, soccer cleats, birthday parties, school trips. I didn't want him to feel different because his mother was gone." Mr. Patterson nodded. "I remember you coming in here when David was 10, asking about setting up a college fund. You had maybe $200 to start with, but you were determined." $200? That's all I'd been able to save after working myself to exhaustion for 4 years. But every month after that, I'd brought Mr. Patterson another $50 or $100 to add to David's education fund. Sometimes it was only $25 when money was especially tight. "You sold your grandfather's pocket watch to pay for his SAT prep classes," Mr. Patterson continued, "and when he got into medical school, you took out loans you couldn't afford to help him with living expenses." Oh, I had forgotten he knew about the watch. My grandfather's beautiful gold pocket watch, the only valuable thing my father had left me. I'd held on to it through Linda's death, through all those lean years, telling myself it was David's inheritance. But when he needed money for those expensive test prep courses that would help him get into a good college, I'd sold it without hesitation. "I wanted him to have opportunities," I said quietly. "I didn't want him to struggle the way I had struggled." "And he did well, didn't he? Full scholarship to undergraduate, medical school loans he was able to pay off quickly once he started his practice." David had done brilliantly. Valedictorian of his high school class, summa cum laude in college, top 10% of his medical school class. He'd become a successful cardiologist by age 30, married a nurse named Karen, bought a beautiful house in the best part of town. Everything I dreamed for him. "When did you meet Helen?" Mr. Patterson asked. 12 years ago. David was already established in his practice, married to Karen, starting to talk about having children. I was 48 and had just been laid off from the engineering firm during downsizing. I was taking a pottery class at the community center, just trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. Helen had been taking the same pottery class. She was recently retired from teaching, recently divorced, and looking for new interests. We'd sat next to each other at the pottery wheel, laughing at our terrible attempts at making bowls. She had the most wonderful laugh, like music. "Helen saved me," I said, my voice breaking. I had spent 18 years focused entirely on raising David, working, surviving. I didn't know who I was beyond being his father. Helen helped me remember that I was a person with my own dreams and interests. We'd been inseparable from that first pottery class. Helen was financially comfortable from her divorce settlement and teacher's pension. I was living in a small apartment on my unemployment benefits and the modest savings I'd managed to accumulate once David was independent. But she never made me feel inferior about money. She'd suggest, trips we could afford on my budget, restaurants that fit my price range. When did you marry? 5 years ago. David walked me down the aisle. The memory was bittersweet now. David had seemed genuinely happy for me that day. He'd given a beautiful toast at our small reception, saying how grateful he was that I'd found someone who made me smile the way Helen did. What changed? Mr. Patterson asked. I thought about it carefully. Jessica, David's second wife. He married her 2 years ago after his divorce from Karen, and everything shifted. She never liked me, never made any effort to hide it. She thought I was too dependent on David, even though I rarely asked him for anything. Jessica had made her feelings clear from the beginning. At their engagement party, she'd cornered me in the kitchen and told me point blank that she expected boundaries in their marriage. No more weekly phone calls with David. No more holiday traditions that included me. No more emotional dependency on her husband. She said I was preventing David from becoming fully independent, I continued. She convinced him that I was a burden, that I was holding him back from reaching his full potential. The cruelest part was that I could see her slowly poisoning David against me. Little comments, small suggestions, a gradual erosion of the relationship I'd spent 36 years building. David started canceling our dinner plans, forgetting to call on important days, making excuses about why they couldn't visit Helen and me. And Helen saw what was happening. Helen saw everything. She tried to warn me, but I didn't want to believe it. I kept making excuses for David, thinking that if I just gave him space, if I didn't push, he'd come around. Helen used to get so frustrated with me. I remembered our last real argument, just 3 weeks before Helen got sick. She'd begged me to stop defending David's increasingly distant behavior. Robert, he's not the same person anymore, Helen had said. That woman is changing him, and not for the better. You need to protect yourself. But I'd been stubborn, convinced that a father's love could overcome anything. I'd been wrong. Tell me exactly what Helen said about calling me if something happened, Mr. Patterson said, leaning forward. I closed my eyes, trying to remember her exact words. She said, if anything ever happens to me, if David ever tries to hurt you, you call Mr. Patterson immediately. He was very serious about it, almost scared. Mr. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. Robert, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to think very carefully about your answers. Something in his tone made my pulse quicken. What kind of questions? Did David ever ask you about your financial situation after he married Jessica? About savings accounts, investments, any assets you might have? I frowned, thinking back. A few times. He said Jessica was helping him plan for their future, and they were curious about what kind of inheritance they might expect someday. I told him the truth, that I didn't have much beyond Social Security and Helen's teacher's pension when she passed. Did he seem to believe that? I thought so, but now I paused, remembering some odd conversations. There were times when Jessica would make comments about how I must have saved more money than I was letting on. She said it wasn't normal for someone who'd worked as long as I had to have so little put away. Mr. Patterson made a note on his legal pad. Did Helen ever mention anything about updating her will or estate planning? Not directly. She said once that she wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of if anything happened to her. We never talked about details. I paused, remembering something. Although in her last few weeks she did mention wanting to take care of some important paperwork. Yes, I thought she meant medical bills or insurance forms. Robert, I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear. Mr. Patterson's tone made my stomach clench. Helen came to see me 6 months ago. She was very concerned about some things she'd observed regarding David and Jessica. 6 months ago. That would have been right around the time Jessica had started making her comments about boundaries and emotional dependency. What kind of things? She said David had been asking questions about your finances, about whether you had any assets he didn't know about. She said Jessica had been pressuring him to find out what kind of inheritance you might leave him someday. The words hit me like a physical blow. That's impossible. I don't have any inheritance to leave. David knows that. Helen was concerned that David might not know that. She said Jessica had convinced him that you'd been hiding money from him, that you were being secretive about your finances. I felt sick. I've never hidden anything from David. When I was working 3 jobs to support us, he saw every bill, every bank statement. He knew exactly how little we had. Helen also said that Jessica had been researching elder law, specifically looking into filial responsibility laws and guardianship procedures. I don't understand what that means. Mr. Patterson leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. Filial responsibility laws require adult children to provide financial support for indigent parents in certain circumstances. Guardianship procedures allow adult children to take legal control of a parent's finances if they can prove the parent is mentally incompetent. The room started spinning. You think Jessica was planning to have me declared incompetent? Helen was worried about that possibility. She said Jessica had been asking David about your mental state, encouraging him to document any signs of confusion or forgetfulness on your part. I thought about Jim's comment on the phone, about David telling people I was having memory issues. The groundwork had been laid months ago. But that doesn't make sense, I said desperately. I don't have any money for them to control. There's nothing to gain by having me declared incompetent. Mr. Patterson opened another folder. Helen disagreed. She believed there might be assets you weren't aware of. What kind of assets? Robert, do you remember your first wife's life insurance policy? Of course. It barely covered her funeral costs. There was nothing left over. That's correct. But do you remember the workers' compensation settlement from her car accident? I frowned. Oh, there wasn't any settlement. The lawyer said the other driver had no insurance, that there was nothing to recover. Mr. Patterson was quiet for a moment. Robert, I need to show you something, but I want you to prepare yourself. This information may be upsetting. Mr. Patterson pulled out a thick stack of documents and spread them across his desk. These are legal papers related to your late wife's death. Helen asked me to research the case after David started asking questions about family finances. I stared at the papers, trying to make sense of the legal language. I don't understand what I'm looking at. The other driver in Linda's accident did have insurance. The insurance company fought the claim initially, which is why your original lawyer told you there was nothing to recover. But 3 years later, after an appeal, there was a substantial settlement paid out. My hand started shaking, but I never saw any money from a settlement. That's because the settlement was paid into a trust fund for David's education per the instructions of the lawyer who was handling your case at the time. The lawyer believed you were too emotionally devastated to make sound financial decisions, so he structured it as a trust that would mature when David reached 30. I felt like I couldn't breathe. How much money? The initial settlement was $180,000. With interest and investment returns over the past 28 years, the trust fund is now worth approximately $450,000. $450,000. Money that had existed all along, money that could have made those years of working 3 jobs unnecessary, money that could have paid for David's college without me selling my grandfather's watch or taking out loans I couldn't afford. Where is this money now? I whispered. That's the complicated part. The trust was set up to transfer to David when he turned 30, which happened 5 years ago. However, there was a clause that if David predeceased you, the money would return to your estate. Additionally, if David ever attempted to harm you financially or emotionally, the trust included provisions for you to reclaim the funds. I stared at him. I don't understand. The lawyer who set up the trust was concerned about creating a situation where David might view you as financially expendable once he inherited the money. He built in protections. What kind of protections? Mr. Patterson pulled out another document. If David ever attempted to have you declared incompetent, if he ever tried to control your finances through legal means, if he ever abandoned his filial responsibilities toward you, the trust would automatically revert to you. The room was spinning. You're telling me that David has been sitting on $450,000 that was meant for his education, money that came from his mother's death? Yes, and Helen believed that Jessica had discovered the trust and was planning to ensure David never triggered the reversion clauses. The easiest way to do that would be to maintain control over you while keeping you financially dependent. By having me declared incompetent. Exactly. If you were declared incompetent, David could control your finances without it being considered abandonment. He could keep the trust money while also having access to whatever resources you did have. I felt nauseous. But I don't have any resources. There's nothing for him to control. Mr. Patterson looked at me seriously. Robert, when did you last check the balance of your savings account? Before Helen died, I had about $12,000. It wasn't much, but it was something. He handed me another piece of paper. According to the bank records Helen requested before her death, your account balance was actually $58,000. I stared at the number, not comprehending. That's impossible. Helen had been quietly adding money to your account for 2 years. She wanted to make sure you would be financially secure if something happened to her, but she didn't want to hurt your pride by telling you. Tears started flowing down my cheeks. Helen had been taking care of me, protecting me, even when I didn't know I needed protection. There's more, Mr. Patterson said gently. Helen suspected that David knew about her contributions to your account. She believed that's why he was so eager to gain control of your finances. So when he froze my account, he gained access to nearly $60,000 that he probably thought you didn't know you had. The betrayal was complete. Not only had David stolen my present, but he'd been hiding money from my past that could have changed everything. And Helen, sweet Helen, had been trying to protect me while also being secretly generous in a way that made my heart break all over again. Robert, Mr. Patterson continued, there's something else you need to know. Helen updated her will 3 months before she died. I looked up at him through my tears. What do you mean? She left everything to you, her house, her savings, her car, all her personal property. She also had the deed to the house transferred into your name 2 months ago. The world stopped. You mean, David sold property that belonged to you, not him. He committed fraud. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. The house David had sold belonged to me. The money he'd frozen was mine. The trust fund he'd been hiding was legally mine under the reversion clauses he'd triggered by abandoning me. How much are we talking about total? I asked quietly. Mr. Patterson consulted his notes. The trust fund reversion, approximately $450,000. Your savings account that Helen had been contributing to, $58,000. The house that was illegally sold, market value around $185,000. Plus damages for elder abuse and fraud. He paused. I'd estimate the total at around $750,000. $750,000. I went from being a homeless man with nothing to being worth $750,000 in the span of a single conversation. What can I do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mr. Patterson looked at his watch. Helen made me promise that if anything happened to her, if David ever mistreated you, I would take immediate action to protect you. She updated her own will 3 months ago with very specific instructions. What kind of instructions? He reached for his phone. The kind that are going to make David very sorry he underestimated both you and his stepmother. Mr. Patterson dialed a number from memory, his expression grim but determined. I sat in the leather chair across from his desk, still reeling from everything he'd told me. David Mitchell's office, a receptionist answered. I could hear her voice through the phone speaker. This is Richard Patterson from Patterson and Associates. I need to speak with Dr. Mitchell immediately regarding his stepmother's estate and certain trust arrangements. I'm sorry, but Dr. Mitchell is with a patient. Can I take a message? Tell him it's about Helen Mitchell's will and the Linda Mitchell Memorial Trust. Tell him it's urgent and cannot wait. There was a pause. Hold, please. Mr. Patterson looked at me while we waited. Robert, I want you to understand what's about to happen. David is going to be shocked, and he's probably going to say things that will hurt you. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the past few days. Sleeping in parking lots, being treated like I was mentally incompetent, watching my car burn, while my son stood there with a baseball bat. How much more could he hurt me? I'm prepared. Dr. Mitchell. The voice that came through the speaker was David's, but he sounded different, nervous. Mr. Patterson, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. David, I'm calling about your stepmother's will and the various trust arrangements that are affected by her death. Trust arrangements? I'm not sure what you mean. Helen didn't have any trusts that I know of. Mr. Patterson looked at me and raised an eyebrow. David was lying, and we both knew it. David, I have your father here in my office. He's told me about the events of the past few days. Selling his house, destroying his car, freezing his bank accounts. There was a long silence. When David finally spoke, his voice was cold. My father is confused, Mr. Patterson. He's been having some memory issues since Helen got sick. Jessica and I have been trying to help him, but he's been resistant to assistance. Is that so? Well, perhaps you can help clear up his confusion. Can you explain why you told him the house belonged to both of you when, according to the deed I have here, it belongs entirely to your father? Another silence. I could practically hear David's mind racing. I don't know what you're talking about. Let me be more specific. Helen Mitchell updated her will 3 months before her death. In that will, she left her house, her savings, and all of her personal property to Robert Mitchell, your father. The deed to the house was transferred into your father's name 2 months ago. You sold property that didn't belong to you, David. I gasped. Helen had left me everything and had made sure the legal documents were in order before she died. David's voice came through the phone, shaky now. That's impossible. Helen would have told me if she was planning something like that. Would she? The same way you told your father about the $450,000 trust fund from his late wife's car accident settlement? The silence that followed was deafening. I could imagine David's face, the color draining from it as he realized Mr. Patterson knew about the hidden money. I don't know what you're talking about, David repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. The Linda Mitchell Memorial Trust that was supposed to revert to your father if you ever abandoned your filial responsibilities toward him? The trust fund that you've been receiving distributions from for the past 5 years without telling him it existed? Mr. Patterson, I think there's been some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, David. I have all the documentation right here. The original trust agreement, the distribution records, the reversion clauses that you've just triggered by your actions toward your father. I watched Mr. Patterson's face as he delivered what I sensed was the final blow. I also have documentation of your wife's research into guardianship proceedings and filial responsibility laws. Did you really think Helen didn't notice Jessica asking all those questions about your father's mental state? David's breathing was audible through the phone now. This is insane. You're making things up. Am I? Then perhaps you can explain why your father's bank account, which contained nearly $60,000 in savings that Helen had contributed over the past 2 years, was frozen within hours of Helen's death, or why you immediately moved to sell property that you knew belonged to your father. He's my father. I was trying to help him by making him homeless, by destroying his car, by cutting off his access to his own money. Mr. Patterson's voice was rising. David, what you've done isn't helping. It's elder abuse, and it's fraud. The words hung in the air like a blade. Elder abuse, fraud, criminal charges. You can't prove any of this, David said, but he sounded desperate now. Actually, I can. I have Helen's documentation of your wife's activities. I have bank records showing the suspicious timing of the account freeze. I have witness statements about your behavior toward your father. And most importantly, I have the legal documents that show you've been stealing from your father for years. Stealing? I never stole anything. You've been receiving distributions from a trust fund that was meant to provide for your father's security in his later years. You never told him the money existed, and you've used his ignorance to justify treating him as a financial burden. That's theft, David. I could hear voices in the background on David's end of the call. Someone was talking to him urgently. Mr. Patterson, David's voice was different now, smaller. What do you want? What I want is irrelevant. What your father is entitled to is everything. The house you sold illegally will need to be bought back at fair market value. The money you've stolen from his accounts will need to be returned immediately. And the trust fund that you've been hiding will revert to his control as specified in the original agreement. How much are we talking about? Mr. Patterson looked at me and I nodded. I wanted to hear the number that represented my son's betrayal. Approximately $550,000, plus damages for the illegal sale of his house, plus compensation for elder abuse. I'd estimate the total at around $800,000. The sound that came through the phone was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "I don't have that kind of money," David's voice cracked through the phone. "Then you'll need to find it, because the alternative is criminal charges for elder abuse, fraud, and theft. I'm sure the medical board would be very interested in a doctor who steals from his elderly father. This is blackmail. No, David, this is consequences. You had a choice to make when Helen died. You could have supported your father, honored the man who sacrificed everything for you. Instead, you chose to victimize him. Now you get to live with the results of that choice." There was a long pause. When David spoke again, his voice was broken. Can I talk to my father?" Mr. Patterson looked at me questioningly. I thought about it for a long moment. 3 days ago, I would have taken any opportunity to hear my son's voice, to hope for reconciliation. But that man had died in a Walmart parking lot. The man sitting in this lawyer's office was someone different. "No," I said clearly, loud enough for David to hear through the phone. He made his choice when he told me not to come crawling back to him. "I'm not crawling, David. I'm standing up. Dad, please." "You have 48 hours to arrange for the return of all funds and property," Mr. Patterson interrupted. "After that, we file criminal charges. This conversation is over." He hung up the phone and looked at me with something like admiration. "How do you feel?" he asked. I thought about it carefully. For the first time in days, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't ashamed. I wasn't confused or desperate or lost. "I feel like Helen would be proud of me." Mr. Patterson smiled. "I know she would be." My phone, which I'd turned off to save battery, buzzed to life as Mr. Patterson's assistant returned it to me, along with a charger she'd found. Immediately, messages started flooding in. Missed calls from David, from Jessica, from numbers I didn't recognize. The first voicemail was David crying, actually crying. "Dad, please call me back. I made a terrible mistake." "Jessica," she convinced me. "I'm so sorry. Please don't do this to me. I'm your son." I deleted it without finishing. The second was Jessica, and her tone was completely different from the woman who had laughed at my homelessness 3 days earlier. "Robert, we need to talk. I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. David is beside himself. He loves you so much, and he's just been overwhelmed with grief. Please call us back so we can work this out." I deleted that one too. By the time I finished listening to the messages, there were 12 more. David begging, Jessica alternating between false sweetness and barely controlled panic, even some numbers I didn't recognize, probably relatives Jessica was calling to pressure me. But the most interesting call came 2 hours later, while I was sitting in a hotel room that Mr. Patterson's firm had paid for while we waited for David's response. It was David again, but this time he wasn't begging. He was angry. "You vindictive old bastard," his voice snarled through the phone. "After everything I did for you, this is how you repay me? You're going to destroy my career, my marriage, my life, just because your feelings got hurt? Helen was right about you. You're a selfish, manipulative man who thinks the world owes you something." I smiled as I deleted that message. There was the real David, the one Jessica had created. The son I'd raised was gone, if he'd ever really existed at all. But that was fine, because tomorrow I would start building a life that didn't depend on his love or approval. And for the first time in 60 years, that felt like freedom. The next morning brought more calls, more desperate messages. David had clearly spent the night trying to figure out how to raise $800,000. Jessica had left 3 voicemails, each one more frantic than the last. "Robert, you have to understand, David didn't know about the trust fund until recently. When he found out, he was planning to tell you, but then Helen got sick and everything happened so fast. This is all a terrible misunderstanding." Another message. "David's talking about suicide, Robert. He says his life is over. Is that what you want? To drive your own son to kill himself?" And finally, "Fine. You want to play hardball? David has friends at the hospital who will testify that you've been showing signs of dementia for months. We'll have you declared incompetent and take control of everything legally. You think you've won, but this is far from over." I played that last message for Mr. Patterson when he called to check on me. "Excellent," he said. "He just made several criminal threats on a recorded line. That should help our case considerably." That afternoon, I received a call from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. Karen, David's first wife. Robert? It's Karen? I heard about what happened with David and Helen. I'm so sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry about everything else. Karen had been a good woman, a dedicated nurse who genuinely cared about people. Her marriage to David had ended 2 years ago, ostensibly because they'd grown apart, but I'd always suspected there was more to the story. Thank you, Karen. That means a lot. Robert, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you when David and I divorced, but I was afraid. What is it? David. He's not the same person you raised. Something changed in him over the years. He became cold, calculating, especially after he started making real money at the practice. I sat down heavily. What do you mean? He started talking about you differently, about how you'd been a burden on him his whole life, how you'd held him back. He said terrible things, Robert. Things about how you were weak and pathetic, how you'd never amounted to anything. The words hurt, but they didn't surprise me anymore. When we were getting divorced, he told me he was planning to cut you off completely once you got older. He said he wasn't going to be responsible for taking care of you, that you'd made your own choices and would have to live with the consequences. Did Jessica put these ideas in his head? She encouraged them, but Robert, the ideas were already there. Jessica just gave him permission to act on them. Karen paused, and I could hear her crying softly. I'm so sorry I didn't warn you. I was scared of what he might do if he found out I was interfering. David can be vindictive when people cross him. Thank you for telling me now, I said. It helps me understand. There's something else. David has been telling people at the hospital that you've been showing signs of Alzheimer's. He's been building a case for months, documenting supposed incidents of confusion or forgetfulness. I think he was planning to have you declared incompetent. So Mr. Patterson had been right. This wasn't a sudden decision made in grief. This was a long-term plan that David had been putting in motion for months, maybe years. Karen, would you be willing to testify about what David told you? Yes, she said without hesitation. It's time someone stood up to him. That evening, Mr. Patterson called with an update. David's lawyer contacted me this afternoon. They want to negotiate. What kind of negotiation? They're offering to return your savings account funds and arrange for the house sale to be reversed. In exchange, they want you to waive any claims to the trust fund and agree not to press criminal charges. I laughed. They're offering to give me back what they stole in exchange for letting them keep what they've been hiding from me for years? That's about the size of it. David's lawyer seems to think you should be grateful for the opportunity to avoid a messy legal battle. What did you tell them? I told them they have until tomorrow at 5 p.m. to arrange for full restitution, or we file both civil and criminal charges. No negotiation, no compromise. And if they don't comply, then David Mitchell is going to discover that actions have consequences, regardless of what his wife told him. That night, I lay in the hotel bed thinking about the man I'd been just a week ago. That man had been desperate for his son's love and approval, willing to accept any scraps of affection David might throw his way. He'd been afraid of being alone, afraid of being abandoned, afraid of not being good enough. That man was gone. In his place was someone I was just beginning to get to know, someone who didn't need to apologize for taking up space in the world, someone who deserved respect and dignity, not because of what he'd done for others, but simply because he was human. I thought about Helen, about how she'd loved me not for what I could do for her, but for who I was. She'd seen value in me that I'd forgotten existed, and in her final act of love, she'd given me the tools to reclaim that value. My phone rang at exactly 4:47 p.m. the next day. Mr. Patterson's voice was calm but satisfied. Robert, I have good news. David's lawyer just called. They're agreeing to full restitution. All of it? Every penny. The trust fund, your savings account, fair market value for the house, plus damages. They'll also be making a substantial contribution to elder abuse prevention programs as part of the settlement. What changed their minds? David's medical license hearing got moved up. The medical board is very concerned about doctors who abuse elderly family members. His lawyer realized that if this goes to court, David won't just lose money, he'll lose his career. I felt a moment of sadness for the little boy I'd raised, the one who dreamed of being a doctor to help people. But that little boy had grown up to be a man who hurt people instead. Sometimes the consequences of our choices are exactly what we deserve. "There's one more thing," Mr. Patterson continued. "David wants to meet with you. He says he needs to explain himself to try to make you understand why he did what he did." I thought about it for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "I don't need his explanations. I understand perfectly why he did what he did. He thought he could get away with it. Are you sure? This might be your only chance to..." "To what? To let him manipulate me one more time? To give him the opportunity to make me doubt myself again?" I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. "No, Richard. I'm done being David's father. It's time for me to figure out who Robert Mitchell is when he's not trying to earn someone else's love." And for the first time since Helen died, that prospect didn't scare me. It excited me. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, making coffee in the quiet morning light. It was a smaller house than the one Helen and I had shared, but it was mine. Every deed, every mortgage payment, every decision about paint colors and furniture placement, all mine. The house Helen had left me was sold to pay for this one, with enough left over to ensure I'd never have to worry about money again. The trust fund David had hidden from me was back under my control. My savings account, now properly managed, had grown beyond anything I'd ever imagined possible. But the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was the silence. David had tried everything in those first few weeks. After the angry voicemail where he'd shown his true colors, he'd switched tactics. Flowers appeared at my hotel room, expensive arrangements with cards begging for forgiveness. When I didn't respond, he started showing up at places he thought I might be. The grocery store, the library, even Helen's grave. I'd gotten a restraining order. Jessica had tried a different approach. He'd called Mr. Patterson's office repeatedly, claiming David was having a nervous breakdown, that he was talking about suicide, that I was destroying an innocent man who'd just made a mistake in his grief. When that didn't work, she tried reaching out to Helen's sister in Oregon, spinning a story about a confused elderly man being manipulated by an unscrupulous lawyer. Helen's sister had called me directly. "Helen told me all about David and that wife of his months before she died," she said. "She was so worried about what they might do to you. I'm glad you're fighting back." The legal process had been swift once David realized the evidence against him was overwhelming. Rather than face criminal charges and the destruction of his medical career, he'd agreed to full restitution. The house sale was reversed, my money was returned with interest, and the trust fund was transferred to my control. He'd also agreed to a no-contact order. For 2 years, David was legally prohibited from contacting me in any way. After that, any relationship we might have would be entirely on my terms. I'd thought I would feel guilty about that. I'd raised him to be better than the man he'd become, and part of me felt responsible for his failures. But Helen had left me one final gift that helped me understand the difference between love and enabling. In her personal papers, which Mr. Patterson had given me along with the legal documents, I'd found letters she'd written but never sent. Letters to me, documenting her observations about David's gradual transformation under Jessica's influence. "Robert," one letter began, "I watch you make excuses for David's increasingly cold behavior, and it breaks my heart. You love him so much that you can't see what he's becoming. But love that requires you to ignore someone's cruelty isn't love, it's self-destruction." Another letter, written just 2 weeks before she died, was even more direct. "You taught David to be kind, generous, and grateful. If he chooses to be cruel, greedy, and entitled instead, that's not a failure of your parenting. That's a failure of his character. You can't love someone into being who they used to be." Reading those words, written in Helen's careful handwriting, had been like receiving permission to stop carrying David's choices as my burden. I'd done everything right as his father. He'd chosen to do everything wrong as my son. Those were separate moral facts. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment old anxieties fluttered in my chest. What if David had found my new address? What if this was another attempt to manipulate me back into his life? But when I looked through the peephole, I saw a young woman about David's age, holding a small bouquet of flowers. She looked nervous but determined. I opened the door cautiously. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Sarah Chen. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm a nurse at the hospital where your son works." "Worked," she corrected herself. My stomach dropped. "Is David hurt?" "No, sir. Nothing like that. I came because—" She hesitated, then seemed to gather her courage. "Dr. Mitchell was fired 3 weeks ago. The hospital board found out about his legal troubles and they decided he was a liability. But that's not why I'm here." I waited, not sure where this conversation was going. "I worked with Dr. Mitchell for 2 years," Sarah continued. "I saw how he treated people, nurses, patients, family members of patients. He was always condescending, always impatient, especially with elderly patients and their families. We all thought it was just his personality." She paused, shifting the flowers to her other hand. "But after the news came out about what he did to you, some of us started talking. We realized that his behavior wasn't just professional arrogance. It was a pattern. He treated vulnerable people like they were disposable." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "There was an elderly patient last year, Mr. Rodriguez. He was confused after his surgery, and Dr. Mitchell told his family that he was probably developing dementia, and they should consider guardianship proceedings to manage his finances. He gave them the name of a lawyer who specializes in that kind of thing. The same thing Jessica had researched, the same trap they'd planned for me." "Mr. Rodriguez's family went through with it," Sarah continued. "They took control of his finances, sold his house, moved him into a nursing home. He died 6 months later, still confused and scared, wondering why his family had abandoned him." "You think David was advising families to do this regularly?" "We think he was getting some kind of kickback from the lawyer he was recommending. There were at least 4 other cases we can remember where he suggested guardianship for elderly patients who probably didn't need it." I leaned against my doorframe, feeling sick. David hadn't just betrayed me. He'd been betraying vulnerable elderly people as part of his regular practice, using his position as a doctor to identify targets for financial exploitation. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Sarah looked uncomfortable. "Because some of us reported our suspicions to the medical board after Dr. Mitchell was fired. They're opening an investigation. His medical license is probably going to be revoked permanently." She held out the flowers. "These are from the nursing staff who worked with him. We wanted you to know that you did the right thing by stopping him. You probably saved other families from going through what you went through." I took the flowers, my hands trembling slightly. How was he taking all this? "Not well. His wife filed for divorce last week. She's claiming she never knew about his illegal activities, trying to distance herself from the whole situation. Dr. Mitchell he's pretty broken up about everything. A year ago, that information would have devastated me. I would have felt guilty for causing my son so much pain, regardless of what he'd done to deserve it. But now, all I felt was a quiet satisfaction that justice was taking its course." "Thank you for coming," I said. "It means a lot to know that some good came from this situation." After Sarah left, I arranged her flowers in one of Helen's vases and placed them on the kitchen table. Then I called Mr. Patterson to let him know about David's job loss and the medical board investigation. "I'm not surprised," he said. "Men who abuse their own fathers rarely limit their cruelty to family members." That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding for months. I drove to Helen's grave. I'd stayed away because I was afraid I'd break down, afraid I'd be overwhelmed by grief and loneliness. But standing there in the quiet cemetery, looking at her simple headstone, I felt something I hadn't expected. Gratitude. "Thank you," I said out loud, not caring if anyone heard me talking to a gravestone. "Thank you for seeing what I couldn't see. Thank you for protecting me even when I was too stubborn to protect myself. Thank you for loving me enough to give me the tools to save myself." The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cemetery. In the distance, I could hear traffic, children playing, life continuing its normal patterns. But here, in this quiet space, I felt a peace I'd never experienced before. I wasn't the same man who had sat in Helen's chair 3 days after the funeral, waiting desperately for my son to show me some kindness. That man had died in a Walmart parking lot, and I was grateful he had. He'd been weak, dependent, afraid of being alone. The man I'd become was none of those things. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. For a moment, my old anxieties fluttered. What if David had gotten a new phone and was trying to contact me? But the message was from Helen's sister in Oregon. Helen's birthday is next month. I'm flying out to visit her grave, and I'd love to meet you properly. Would you like to have lunch? I smiled and typed back, I'd like that very much. Driving home through the quiet streets of my neighborhood, I thought about the difference between the family you're born with and the family you choose. David had been my blood, but he'd never truly been my family. Helen had been my family. Helen's sister, who wanted to maintain connection with me despite having no biological obligation to do so, was my family. At home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my back porch, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow, I was starting a volunteer position at a local senior center, helping elderly people navigate legal and financial issues. Mr. Patterson had suggested it, thinking my experience might help others avoid the trap I'd fallen into. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't defined by my relationship to someone else. I wasn't Linda's widower or David's father or Helen's husband. I was just Robert, a man who had survived betrayal and found strength he didn't know he possessed. My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. The caller ID showed David's old number, the one that should have been disconnected. My finger hovered over the decline button, but something made me hesitate. I answered, "Dad?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "Please don't hang up." I said nothing. "I lost everything," he continued. His words slurred slightly. He'd been drinking. Jessica left me. I lost my job. They're taking my medical license. I have nothing left. Still, I said nothing. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I hurt you in ways that can't be fixed. But you're still my father, and I'm still your son, and I don't know what to do. I took a sip of my wine and looked up at the stars. "Please," he whispered. "I need help." Finally, I spoke. "David, I spent 36 years helping you. I gave you everything I had, everything I was, and when I needed you most, you threw me away like garbage. I know, I'm not finished," I said calmly. "You made a choice to believe Jessica's lies about me instead of trusting the man who raised you. You made a choice to steal from me, to try to control me, to abuse me. Those were your choices, not mistakes forced on you by grief or manipulation." He was crying now. I could hear it in his breathing. "The consequences you're facing now are the results of your choices. Not my revenge, not unfair punishment, but natural consequences. And just like you had the right to choose how to treat me, I have the right to choose how to respond to that treatment." "What does that mean?" he asked, though I think he already knew. "It means you're not my son anymore. You gave up that relationship when you decided I was disposable. It means that if you need help, you'll need to find it somewhere else, because I'm no longer available to be used by you. Dad, please." "Goodbye, David." I hung up and immediately blocked his number. Then I sat back in my chair, finished my wine, and watched the stars until it was time to go inside to my own house, my own bed, my own life. For the first time in 60 years, I was completely, peacefully alone, and it was perfect.